bit, I've got like about 4 or 5 objections that I want to consider. I'm not sure exactly how to untangle myself. So, some background. So, about 4 years ago, I was working with Eric Merrill and Eric Smith on Ontology of Commercial Exchange, and we were working from some really good work by Tiefenbach and Masson on metaphysics of values for economics. And so in this feedback, I'm going to give a little bit of a preview of what that is going to look like, but in some of that development, we were trying to give an account of what are the necessary components for buying and selling and how that fits in an economic exchange. And then since then, Eric has done some really good work with Masson and Smith to give a shift of this account so that it fits better with the Common Core ontologies. So both of these efforts were in hopes that it would be in support for the industrial ontologies foundry. And Eric was able to give some clearer definitions that fit better with the definitions in Common Core. Some other efforts that I've been focusing on related is to give an account for document acts that kind of translates the one that's in the OBO Foundry into the document acts version in the Common Core ontologies. And so this is seriously under development, but both of these you can get on my GitHub. Now, as a matter of preview for what this account is, at least as I understand it, the traditional account for economic exchanges, buying and selling, and so on, is that paradigmatically you are exchanging goods. So you can easily account for bartering. It's one good for another. If you're talking about buying and selling, say with a monetary instrument, you've got a good, at least on one side, with physical good, and then you've got some money, which, depending on how you want to account for money, what the best version of that is, it's going to, whether it's a physical thing or otherwise, it's, again, the thing that's being swapped. It gets a little bit weirder when you talk about services, but at least when you're doing a service for money, money would probably be the physical object, and then when you get to services for services, that sounds even weirder. And so the traditional account has to say, well, these services are abstract goods or immaterial goods or intangible goods, and we're going to shift what we mean by goods, but in some respects, because they want to say goods and services are on kind of like a continuum. But the service-centric account wants to say that services are the most fundamental part of exchanges, and it can easily account for all the stuff. So you could have service for service, because it's always happening, but when we're talking about goods, the service that's involved is, say, transferring a good from one person to another, or transferring ownership, or transferring this, or transferring that, granting, sharing. These are all activities, and those are the things that you'd be exchanging. So we got some decent examples. So suppose Eric and David are participating in a commercial act, an active commercial exchange. Maybe Eric wants to do some landscaping labor in exchange for David doing some automobile repair. They're going to acquire certain roles where they've obligated each other to perform these actions. They're acting with a view toward the other person performing their actions. And when they fulfill both of their duties, then both of these roles are discharged, and they're no longer obligated to what they said they would do. And so both of these people, in this case, they have converged on favorable terms for an exchange, and that's where the creation of these roles comes into play. They've obligated each other by consent. You can do this not just for services, but you can also do this for certain goods. So active transferring an apple for an active transferring dollar bill. In this case, Allen and Werner. So in both of these cases, they're converging on favorable terms for exchange. Now, what is the basis for this favorable exchange? It's going to be largely what Eric and David and Allen and Werner actually prefer. So this is going to sound very Austrian from an economic standpoint. So what is the value of an orange? You can't answer that just by looking at the qualities of the orange. Its flavor and so on and so forth, its ripeness. You have to be considering it in terms of the person's preferences with regard to the orange. Now, there's lots of different ways we can talk about value, like aesthetic, moral, whatever. But when we're talking about market value, we're talking about exchange value. And exchange value has to bring into consideration what people would prefer to exchange. And so that has to do with a realizable entity. What they would do has to do with their dispositions. So what are their preferences? And that changes. That's not exactly stable. They could have not only a taste for orange and an allergy for grapes or something like that. They could also just be like, I'm really tired of oranges and I don't want those today. Doesn't really matter. But whatever the case, we're talking about a disposition. So if we're talking about a dispositional account of price, we could talk about, this is kind of rough, an agent having a certain disposition. And this agent is going to predict something about this entity, whatever they're considering. And I'm trying to leave it general, whether it's a material object or a process, whatever. We're just talking about the entity. And they've got this predictive information entity about that thing that they're considering. So what is their prediction? Well, it's going to come into account of what is the potential benefit that they're going to get. You know, they can predict that they can do certain things with this activity, with this entity, and then they're going to say, oh yeah, I really like the potential that's there. I want to take this prediction and go somewhere with it. And so the agent then has, as this active evaluation, some measurement of potential benefit, and that just is going to pair up here with measurements of monetary value. So if Werner has considered the apple, and his final output is to say, well, regarding this apple, I think it's about a decimal value of 74 cents, or 0.74 in US dollars. But it's according to a measurement monetary system. Now, when you kind of include other people, you're going to have to bring into account that not only do you have your preference for oranges, other people do as well. And so everybody has preferences on oranges. And so if someone were to talk about, well, this person values and has a measurement that comes to 74 cents, that might not be the same for somebody else, but they're going to have a tendency to converge when you consider them not on the individual level, but on the aggregate. So as an example, going back to Bitcoin, so we've got a snapshot of Coinbase where you can see a convergence point for what people prefer to buy Bitcoin at, the rate, and prefer to sell at the Bitcoin rate. And the convergent point is where those preferences are realized. You get actual transactions on the books, and if you track that convergent point over time, it's going to fluctuate much in the day, but also across the days it's going to fluctuate highs and lows and everything. And so this graph is just a measurement of where convergences have been made in the past. But what's underlying the actual valuation, the dispositions realized in putting out orders of certain preferences to be exchanged and so on, like that's what's underlying and explaining why it goes in this way. Dispositions change over time. People's preferences change over time. So now that just means that if we're going to talk about anything's value, there's not like this abstract value that it has independently. It's always going to be in this overarching web of interests that kind of create this rank ordering system, again, at the aggregate level. So you've got subjective values of these classes of items, and then you've got over time convergence points that tend to be there to rank goods in certain ways. And so one thing's going to come out to be, 74 cents, and that's why the store is going to be just like, yeah, we're going to sell it for 74 cents, because that's a convergent point that we are going to maximize our profits. So for this, we can then say that aggregates are the proper subject of analysis for this question. So the consumer price index is one way of trying to measure what kind of cost of goods and services for an economy, and this is one way people try to go about measuring inflation and so on. So the consumer price index, it's a measurement of a bucket of goods and services, and so it's going to get something like fuel, milk, haircuts, all the different things that would be hypothetically a representative sample of what the economy is doing. And so if you've got a good representative sample of the rest of the economy, of the different types of goods that matter to a wide variety of people, then you can make good inferences about what direction the economy is going to go. And so you can think of these different individual goods being kind of vectors on, like in a bucket. Maybe the bucket has kind of this center of mass to it, or momentum or whatever. But you can imagine that over time, that still allows for them to change relative to each other, just as you could have a rock rolling as it's thrown. So that's things going up and down in the economy. So if we're going to have that as the standard way people want to talk about it, again, it's supposed to be a representative sample of what's actually going on across a wide variety of goods and services, across a wide variety of dispositions for social agents. So if we want to talk about inflation or deflation of a good, we're saying that this is a change in disposition of the aggregate of social agents and how they would value a type of good or service relative to some standpoint. And so the normal way that people would do so, at least in the US, is to make the standpoint some currency like the US dollar, to say certain goods have gone up in price relative to the dollar. Now you could change that standpoint though. Now, if we want to think about inflation or deflation of currency, you'd have a change of disposition of aggregate social agents, how they would value that currency relative, again, to some other standpoint. So goods and services, I'm trying to argue, are not inflationary or deflationary in themselves, but instead only in the context of a valuation tendency of an aggregate. So as examples that are obvious for currencies, the Venezuelan bolivar, that just becoming nearly worthless. You could get a stack of some of the highest denominations for only $1 because of hyperinflation. Why does it hyperinflate? I'm not going to get into the etiology for it, but at least we could say this, that the social agents change their disposition for what they would exchange for that thing. The same thing happens with the dollar. Now, historically, we've also been saying that the US dollar is inflationary, especially after 1973, where we left the gold standard. But that is by program. That's something that we've said, we're going to be printing X, Y, and Z. We're going to increase the volume relative to the population and goods. And so we're trying to set it up so that we can predict the tendencies that would happen for the aggregate. And it's going to go up at 2% or something like that each year, but that can also change. I'm sure there are plenty of other different things. Bitcoin is also said to be deflationary in that it's got a hard cap supply limit of 21 million Bitcoin ever to be mined by the year 2140. And for that, the idea here is that they're saying, hey, hard limit. There's not going to be a maximum value above. We're always going to outpace the demand compared to supply, increasingly over time. So it's deflationary, but I'm trying to say that it is not deflationary in itself. It's only relative to the tendencies of an aggregate. Okay, so some objections. I want to say that I'm not sure who would be giving these objections. I'm just trying to generate them myself. So first, someone might say, hey, it looks like baking into your definition social agents. It seems like you would have to give me a really good definition, clarity on what counts as a social agent. Would say capuchin monkeys count as social agents? Maybe they're social, but maybe they're not agents. Like in a maybe moral sense. Maybe they aren't persons or something like that. And Harvard studies have shown that they were able to get kind of like a monkey economy, and it didn't take very long for them to reinvent prostitution. So do capuchin monkeys count as social agents in the sense that I'm talking about? Related, you could have AI trading bots. For AI trading bots, this is a little bit harder because if I'm going to talk about social agents, the most paradigmatic examples seem to be persons and like aggregates of persons, like organizations and so on. But when I'm talking about AI trading bots, it sounds like I'm talking about software. And that seems like it's less appropriate because software probably can't have dispositions. And aggregates of software can't have dispositions. At least that's how it's built out, since it's a generically dependent continuant. It can't be a bearer of a disposition. So is there a way to get me out of this? For the AI trading bots, I mean, hypothetically, you could just say the ultimate explanation for the way that AI trading bots can buy and sell commodities, hundreds per hour, is because ultimately the physical dispositions of the servers are the explanation for the dispositions. But that seems like it's a little unsatisfying. I'm not sure what to do with it. Second, inflation or deflation. I think a lot of people are going to say that this could buck against a realist approach in that we want to say that the value is intrinsic to the thing and that it's not stance dependent. Maybe it's being stance dependent. Shouldn't that cause like some contradictions? Like something is of such value, like it's inflated or it's deflated at the same time. That sounds like nonsense. But I think the way I want to go about this is to say that it is true measured by x and that say would be inflated, and true that it's deflated measured by y. And since we have two measurement standards, x and y, there's no explicit or implicit contradiction. I think that's my way to go about that. For 3, inflation, deflation is properly said of the thing or the service. This is pretty similar to 2, but have maybe a little spin on it that it would be about a change in the entity's worth, and that we're getting caught up in talking about numerical values of price, which is at best like a proxy. I'm going to say, well, I'm still not sure that we want to talk about like the entity's worth, because I want that ultimately to be grounded outside of the thing, partly because of an epistemic worry. I'm not sure that we would know what something's worth is independent of any valuer, but also I'm not sure what it would count for it to have this like objective value, especially when we're talking about market value. I'm now talking about whether it's scarce or it's important for our life or something like that. Those come into consideration for market value to some extent, less so for air, but because it's not scarce. But I don't think this is a fruitful way to go forward if we're going to talk about the entity's worth. I think it's most useful to talk about how they would be valued by agents and aggregates of agents. I guess I could skip number 4 for the sake of time. And for 5, aggregates of social agents or aggregates of dispositions. I actually don't know whether this distinction matters. If we need to talk about the aggregates of agents that are disposed in a certain way versus aggregates of dispositions, what are we exactly measuring? What actually is going to be the change? It seems like might be a difference of directly or indirectly, or properly or improperly said. Like it's properly said of the aggregate of dispositions, improperly said of the social agents. We get social agents for free because we're talking about the dispositions that inhere in those agents. I'm not sure, but I'm also not sure if it's a problem here. So I will stop there for some questions. Alan.
It seems like a good story about value, but I'm not sure how it tells you about inflation.
Why do these be pulled apart so? Tell me more.
Well, inflation is something like a trend or something happening over time. This sort of is a static value, static thing that you're talking about. There's a set of agents, there's a valuation that's happening at a time, and there's some sort of balance that's happening. What I'm not seeing is sort of what's the representation of a trend, I guess. Or is inflation simply a trend in valuation?
So you can think of a trend as a prediction on where you think dispositions are going or have gone, right? Like a trajectory.
Okay.
Yeah, but it still sounds like we're talking about the aggregate of dispositions. That is what we're describing the dispositions, and we can keep track of how they've changed over time. But I guess maybe you could.
I guess what's happening with inflation is a bunch of things are going up in price in aggregate. So what exactly is happening? That is the value of money that's going down. Is it that standpoint, so to speak, is changing? I guess I'm just not seeing what the inflation part of this is. I do see what the valuation part of this is.
Okay. So if I were to say that if we're talking about the way that a price is going up, like what it sounds like, well, that's a process. So what is the process, and what's the disposition underlying that process, or realizing that process? If I were to say that the price is going up, I'm talking about measurements are changing in value. You've got different measurements at different times, and when we make those comparisons, we're noticing that one is higher than the other or one is lower than the other. But if your question is more about like stance dependence, say the US dollar is going down in like some abstract notion of value in comparison to the goods and services that we can buy with it, that's what it means for it to be inflated. And then we could capture maybe the same story. The prices of the objects are going up if you make the dollar the standpoint. So it seems like you could capture the same story, inflation, deflation, just depending on which anchor point you take. But they're both going to be true. It's just which stance are you going to take. Is that helpful, or?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I forget your name, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
3 little questions. You started with dispositions in an aggregate, and at the end you talked about dispositions of an aggregate. Was that intended? Second, why go for dispositions at all and not for the actual transactions on the market? Well, if our dispositions change, but we do not realize that, would that mean inflation? And third, don't you need an additional filter? So the disposition of millionaires to pay for Van Gogh is increasing. They want to spend more and more dollars for an original Van Gogh, but that's not inflation, is it?
Right, so I guess for the last one, it seems like if we're going to talk about inflation, we have like a big macro view of common set of goods or a common currency, right? And so maybe it'd be strange if we only pointed to one specific good and say that it's inflated. Yeah. Is there a way that I can get out of that? Not sure. Not sure. Let me see. Yeah, because it's, if I can't say that individual goods can be inflated or deflated, then let's see. Yeah, no, that's an interesting problem. So then I don't know what the value of going in the direction of the transactions themselves, how that's going to help us. Could you say more?
Well, I thought about it the other way around. Think about, we have this increasing disposition. We are ready to pay more for a bottle of water because we are so thirsty or whatever. But there are no bottles around. We do not ever realize this disposition. And then there's plenty of water supply again. Our disposition decreases again. Did an inflation happen? Although all our dispositions to pay more were never realized.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a problem to say that there are certain dispositions that we don't know about, and we don't know when they're realized or if they're realized at all.
That because that's our disposition.
Yeah, but there are cases where your disposition changes to some extent because you've been given information that seems relevant. Like you think something's scarce, and so you are now disposed to treat it differently. And that can be somewhat influenced, but it kind of gets back to your set of preferences at a given time, and that can be highly variable. Like how much sleep I want when it's early in the morning, it's very different from early afternoon, and so on. I think I'm running out of time, but there were like a bunch of hands.
So I'm
Yeah.
not going to give my talk, so relax.
Oh, well, I just didn't want to run over for Gloria.
But we can just move things along.
Okay. Well, that's good. Thank
I
you.
have a question also.
Go for it.
So you are saying that a certain kind of value is dependent upon a certain kind of social aggregate. And I think it might be relevant that other kinds of value are dependent on social aggregates in similar ways, but also in different ways. So an idea which I've been pursuing for a long time is that the deontic value of a promise in giving rise to a claim and an obligation depends upon the existence of a tendency to punish promise breakers in the wider society, which means in the relevant social aggregate. One similarity is that in both cases, it's only a few people who actually do anything, or know anything, or think anything, who are relevant. But yet, we have to say social aggregate because we don't know which of those people will be doing the thing, or knowing the thing, or...
Yeah, that's good. I'm not going to want to say that for all kinds of values, but I am definitely appreciating other ways that this might spill over, say aesthetic value and so on.
And of course, money in the end is a promise.
Yeah, and if that gives a more general account, then that might actually be some more satisfying.
I have a question off his. If the disposition is quote unquote universal, but it's an aggregate of dispositions and it's an aggregate of social agents, does this become a temporal event that can change? Because the social agents that affect maybe the price or the inflation of something in 1912 are very different than maybe the social agents or the aggregate of dispositions that affect the inflation of something in 2023. So do we need to temporalize these aggregates in order to get a better view? Or is it just, it's the disposition aggregate and it always is the...
Yeah, it certainly can help. I'm sorry, it certainly can help because when Bitcoin goes down, I buy.
Yeah.
And that's temporally related, you know, maybe it's always at 7 a.m. or something. I think other questions, I'm going to just take one-on-one if you don't mind. Thank you for your time.
Get all the way.
Does this clicker actually work?
Sometimes.
Would you like to?
Okay, so thank you very much for attending my talk. My name is Gloria, and I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy here at UB. And I'm writing my dissertation on the ontology of finance, and more in particular, I'm trying to provide a realist account of some financial entities that, at least in my intention, they should be then used like a sort of foundation for a BFO conformant ontology of finance. And in my dissertation, I'm considering especially money and financial transactions. But in the near future, I'm planning to consider also financial assets that are particularly challenging, according to me. And so today, I would like to share with you some of these challenges, because I think that's the perfect place where to have a feedback and suggestions. And so this is basically the plan for today. So I will give you a bit of background about why we need ontology of finance, and I will very briefly present two projects to provide such an ontology, and I also explain why realism-based ontology of finance can be an interesting project to carry on. And then I will consider some challenges. In particular, I'm going to considering stock. I don't have solutions or a proposal, but again, I think it would be interesting to discuss with you how to solve these problems. And then obviously there will be the conclusions. So first of all, why we need an ontology of finance? The last crisis showed that in the financial sector, the information technology is not very effective, and we weren't able, for example, to assess properly what is called systemic risk. This the potential collapse of the entire financial system. And this was caused because, on one hand, financial institutions were unable to produce reliable records on their financial risk. And on the other hand, they were also unable to properly exchange information and so to communicate. As can you imagine, is a very serious problem, the lack of interoperability, since nowadays there are securities that are very complex and that are created by merging many other securities, and all this process requires many transactions, and so it's interesting to be able to keep track of all these securities and transactions. So, a well-designed ontology of finance would help to solve part of these problems, because on one hand, as you know, an ontology can promote interoperability, and so the ability of different systems to communicate and exchange data. On the other hand, it can also help to organize data and also facilitate automated reasoning. And so that would be interesting, because that would be help, for example, banks to produce more reliable records. So the first project I want to consider is FIBO. It is a long-term project that began in some years ago, and the goal was to promote interoperability in the financial sector. So the advantage of FIBO is that it is a very large project, so it's a collection of a large number of ontologies representing different terms concerning different areas of the financial sector, such as loans, securities, currency, and so on. And so I think that in any case, FIBO can be an interesting reference point, at least for the terms. But on the other hand, FIBO has a very serious problem, because it doesn't have an upper level ontology. So basically, as you can see, all the terms, basically it provides a list of terms, and they all derive from thing. And for example, agreement and aspect, they both derive from thing. Now, of course, they are things. But on the other hand, they are quite different things, and so it would be useful to have some intermediate terms that can sort them. The lack of an upper level ontology is a serious problem, because as we know, an upper level ontology helps to promote interoperability. That is, by the way, the goal FIBO was proposed initially. And also, an upper level ontology can also facilitate the work when different groups of people are working on different portions of the same ontology. And also, an upper-level ontology can also facilitate the process of matching ontologies. The other project I want to consider is Ontofine. It is a very recent project, and it's still very much in progress. It includes 4 core ontologies and 1 domain ontology. So unlike Five, Ontofine has an upper level ontology that is UFO.